Dogs and the Homeless, a Friendship Without Conditions. Part 1. Life on the Streets. The city never truly slept. Even in the quietest hours of the night, there were always cars rushing past, neon signs flickering in the distance, and footsteps echoing down empty alleyways. For most, it was just another night. But for Jack and Duke, it was another battle for survival. Jack pulled his worn-out coat tighter around himself, bracing against the cold wind that cut through the city like a knife. Beside him, Duke, a scruffy, golden-furred mutt, pressed close, sharing his warmth. They sat under the dim glow of a street lamp, tucked against the side of an old brick building, using an old blanket as their only shield against the freezing pavement. Jack reached down and gently scratched behind Duke's ears, a small smile flickering across his weathered face. "Guess it's just you and me again, buddy," he murmured. Duke let out a soft huff, leaning into Jack's touch, his tail thumping weakly against the ground. They had no home, no bed, no certainty about where their next meal would come from. But they had each other, and in a world that had turned its back on them, that was enough. Once, life was different. Jack hadn't always been homeless. There was a time, what felt like a lifetime ago, when he had a job, an apartment, and a sense of security. He had been a construction worker, strong and capable, spending his days building homes for other people. Ironically, now, he couldn't even afford one for himself. It started with an injury. A fall from scaffolding left him with a fractured leg, unable to work. Bills piled up. Rent went unpaid. Then came the eviction notice. With no family to turn to and no savings left, Jack was forced onto the streets. He learned quickly that homelessness wasn't just about losing a roof over your head. It was about becoming invisible. People stopped looking at him. He could sit on a sidewalk for hours, and no one would meet his eyes. The same people he once worked beside now crossed the street to avoid him. The loneliness was worse than the hunger. Until he met Duke, a chance encounter that changed everything. It had been one of the coldest nights of the year. Jack had been wandering through an alleyway, desperately searching for anything that could help him stay warm. Discarded newspapers, an old coat left behind in a dumpster. Anything. That's when he heard it. A faint whimper. Jack turned the corner and saw a small, shivering dog curled up next to an overflowing trash bin. The pup was nothing but skin and bones, his golden fur matted and dirty, his ribs painfully visible beneath his thin frame. But what struck Jack the most was the look in the dog's eyes, a mix of fear and exhaustion. "Hey, buddy," Jack said softly, kneeling down. The dog flinched but didn't run. Jack slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out the only food he had, a half-eaten sandwich he had been saving for later. He broke off a piece and held it out. For a moment, the dog hesitated, but hunger won over fear. He took the food gently, his tail wagging just slightly. Jack smiled. "You're not much different from me. Huh, just looking for a little kindness in the world." The dog finished eating and tentatively stepped closer, resting his head against Jack's knee. And just like that, they became each other's family, surviving together. From that day forward, Jack and Duke were inseparable. The streets were harsh, unforgiving, but somehow, having each other made it a little easier to bear. Jack shared every scrap of food he found with Duke, often giving him more than he ate himself. Duke, in return, kept Jack safe. Whenever someone got too close at night, Duke would growl low in his throat, his protective instincts kicking in. One night, when a stranger tried to steal Jack's small bag of belongings while he was asleep, Duke barked fiercely and lunged, scaring the thief away. "Good boy," Jack whispered, hugging him tightly. "You saved me, buddy." They begged together during the day, finding a spot near a busy cafe where people were more likely to stop and offer spare change. Some people ignored them completely. Others scoffed, muttering that Jack should just get a job. But every once in a while, someone would show kindness, a warm coffee, a spare sandwich, a gentle pat on Duke's head. And in those moments, Jack was reminded that not everyone in the world had forgotten how to care. The coldest night, winter had always been the hardest time. The shelters in the city didn't allow dogs, so Jack refused to go without Duke. "I'm not leaving you, buddy. You wouldn't leave me, right?" Duke licked Jack's face in response, as if saying, "Of course not." So they braved the streets together. But this winter was harsher than the last. Temperatures dropped below freezing. One night, as Jack and Duke huddled under a bridge, the cold sank deep into Jack's bones. He hadn't eaten all day, and his body was struggling to keep warm. His hands shook as he pulled his thin blanket tighter around himself. Duke sensed something was wrong. Instead of curling beside Jack, he climbed onto his chest, pressing his body against him, sharing as much warmth as he could. Jack's eyes watered, not from the cold, but from the sheer devotion in Duke's eyes. "You're too good for this world, buddy," he murmured, stroking Duke's fur. Duke simply rested his head on Jack's chest, refusing to move, refusing to let the cold take away the only family he had left. That night, as the wind howled around them, Duke saved Jack's life just by staying. Hope in the darkness. Jack often wondered what his life would have been like if he had never met Duke. Would he have given up? Would he have let the loneliness consume him? But Duke never let him fall too deep into despair. Whenever Jack felt like there was nothing left to fight for, Duke would nuzzle his hand, or lick his face, or wag his tail just enough to remind him, "You still have me." And so, no matter how hard life became, Jack kept going, not just for himself, but for the dog who had chosen to love him when no one else would. Because sometimes, love doesn't come in the form of a warm house or a comfortable life. Sometimes, love is just a dog curled up beside you on a cold night, refusing to leave your side, no matter what. Part 2. Struggles and Sacrifices. The winter was relentless. For Jack and Duke, every night was a fight against the cold, against hunger, against the ever-present reality that the streets took more than they gave. But they had each other, and that had always been enough. Until one night, everything changed. A night too cold. The wind cut through Jack's thin coat like a blade, making his entire body tremble. His fingers were numb, his breath visible in the icy air. Duke curled against him, his warm body the only thing keeping Jack from succumbing to the cold. Jack had barely eaten that day. His stomach growled, but the hunger was secondary to the exhaustion. He held Duke close, burying his face in the dog's scruffy fur. "Just hold on, buddy," he murmured. "We'll make it through this." Duke licked Jack's cheek, his tail wagging weakly. And then, the cold seeped deeper. Jack's eyelids felt too heavy, his body too weak. It would be so easy to just close his eyes, just for a little while. Duke, sensing something was wrong, suddenly barked sharply, pushing his nose against Jack's face. Jack stirred, his body sluggish. "I'm okay, bud. Duke barked again, louder. It was the only thing keeping Jack awake. And then, footsteps. A woman's voice. "Sir, are you all right?" Jack forced his eyes open, blinking through the haze of exhaustion. A middle-aged woman in a thick winter coat stood in front of him, her face etched with concern. She held a thermos in one hand and a grocery bag in the other. "Here," she said, kneeling. "Drink this." She unscrewed the cap of the thermos and handed it to him. The scent of hot soup filled the air, making Jack's stomach twist with longing. Duke watched cautiously, always protective, always aware. Jack took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest, waking up his senses just a little. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. The woman glanced at Duke. "Your dog is the only reason you're still conscious right now," she said gently. "He saved your life." Jack looked at Duke, his throat tightening. "Yeah," he whispered. "He always does." A tempting offer. The woman introduced herself as Margaret, a volunteer at a local shelter. "You can't stay out here," she said. "The temperature's dropping even more tonight. There's a place where you can get a hot meal, a bed, warmth." Jack nodded. He had heard it before, but he also knew the truth. "They won't let Duke in," he said quietly. Margaret hesitated. "No," she admitted, "but he can stay at the animal shelter overnight. They'll take care of him while you rest." Jack's chest tightened. He knew Duke would be fed, warm, and safe. But after everything, after all the nights Duke had kept him alive, after all the moments where Duke had refused to leave his side, how could he leave Duke now? As if sensing Jack's turmoil, Duke pressed against him, eyes full of unwavering trust. I can't, Jack said finally, shaking his head. I'm not leaving him. Margaret sighed, sadness flickering in her eyes. I understand, she said softly. She pulled out a small package from her grocery bag and placed it beside him, a fresh sandwich, a bottle of water, and a blanket. If you ever change your mind, the shelter is just 3 blocks away, she said. And if you ever need more food for your dog, come find me. I'll help where I can. Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. Thank you, he whispered. Margaret smiled. He's lucky to have you, she said. Jack watched her walk away, her kindness leaving an ache in his chest. Because the truth was, he wasn't sure if he was the lucky one, or if Duke was. The price of loyalty. Jack sat in silence for a long time, the sandwich untouched in his lap. Then, he tore it in half and gave a piece to Duke. Eat, buddy, he said softly. Duke hesitated, his eyes flicking to Jack. He never ate until Jack did. Jack sighed, forcing himself to take a bite of his half. Only then did Duke eat, wagging his tail just a little. They finished in silence, the blanket wrapped around both of them. But Jack couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's words. The shelter, the warmth, the rest. He wanted it. He needed it. But he needed Duke more. And so, he stayed. Because Duke had never left him, and he wouldn't leave Duke either. An unseen threat. The city streets could be cruel. Jack knew that better than anyone. And one night, danger came when he least expected it. They were sleeping in their usual spot near a closed convenience store. It was late, past midnight, when Duke suddenly lifted his head and growled. Jack stirred. What is it, bud? Duke stood up, his posture rigid, his teeth slightly bared. And then, Jack heard it. Footsteps. A shadow moved at the edge of the alley. Jack barely had time to react before a man stepped into view, tall, rough-looking, with hungry eyes. Hey, old man, the stranger sneered. Got any cash? Jack's heart pounded. I don't have anything, he said, already knowing it wouldn't matter. The man stepped closer. Duke's growl deepened. A warning. Back off, Jack said, gripping Duke's collar lightly. But the man wasn't interested in listening. He lunged, and Duke attacked. With a fierce snarl, Duke leaped forward, his teeth snapping at the man's arm. The stranger cursed, stumbling back. You crazy mutt, he shouted. Duke didn't stop. He stood his ground, barking furiously, his body positioned between Jack and the threat. The man cursed again, backing away. Not worth it, he muttered before disappearing into the night. Jack let out a shaky breath. He dropped to his knees, pulling Duke into a tight embrace. Good boy, he whispered, his voice trembling. You saved me again. Duke licked Jack's face, his tail wagging despite the tension. Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand through Duke's fur. One day, buddy, he murmured. One day, I swear I'll get us off these streets. But deep down, he wondered if that day would ever come. Part 3. A glimpse of hope. The night Duke had protected Jack from the stranger was a wake-up call. Jack had always known the streets were dangerous. But this was different. That man could have had a weapon. He could have hurt Duke. And Jack couldn't let that happen. Duke had saved him, again. Now, it was Jack's turn to find a way to save Duke. A familiar face. Morning came slowly, the city awakening with the hum of traffic and the chatter of pedestrians. Jack sat on his usual street corner. Duke curled beside him, his golden fur catching the soft morning light. Jack wasn't one to beg, he hated it. But he wasn't too proud to accept kindness when it came. Today, kindness came in the form of Margaret. She spotted them before Jack noticed her, her face softening as she approached. You made it through the night, she said, crouching beside them. Jack nodded. Barely. Margaret sighed. She reached into her bag and pulled out a warm croissant wrapped in a napkin and a fresh bottle of water. Here, eat. Jack hesitated. And before you try to give half to Duke, Margaret added with a knowing smile, I brought something for him, too. She pulled out a sealed package of dog food. Duke perked up immediately, sniffing the air, his tail wagging. Jack exhaled. shaking his head. You're too kind to us. Margaret shrugged. Everyone deserves kindness. Jack didn't argue. He just ate slowly, savoring every bite. Duke devoured his food, his tail wagging happily as he looked at Margaret with adoration. He really likes you, Jack observed. Margaret smiled. I like him, too. She hesitated, then said, Jack, I meant what I said before. You can't stay out here. And I've been thinking, maybe there's another option. Jack tensed. There's a shelter program, one that allows dogs. It's not in the city, but I know the director. They offer temporary housing and help people get back on their feet. Jack blinked. A shelter that allows dogs? Yes. Jack's heart pounded. It sounded too good to be true. The fear of hope. Jack had spent so long expecting nothing that the idea of hope scared him. Because what if it didn't work out? What if they went there, only to be turned away? What if it was just another place where he'd be told that he didn't belong? And worst of all, what if someone tried to take Duke away? Margaret seemed to sense his hesitation. It's your choice, she said gently, but at least think about it. No pressure. Jack ran a hand through Duke's fur, feeling the warmth of his best friend beside him. Duke had never left him. Now, he had to decide if he would take a chance, for Duke's sake. If not his own. A difficult decision. Jack spent the rest of the day thinking. Every time he looked at Duke, he knew what the answer had to be. That night, as they huddled under a bridge for warmth, Jack spoke softly. What do you think, bud? Duke lifted his head, tilting it slightly. Jack chuckled. Yeah, I know. You'll follow me anywhere. He sighed. Maybe it's time I followed someone, too. The journey to the shelter. The next morning, Jack found Margaret in their usual spot. All right, he said. We'll try it. Margaret grinned, relief flooding her face. You won't regret this, Jack. She helped arrange transportation, and by the afternoon, Jack and Duke were in a car for the first time in years. Duke sat beside Jack in the back seat, his ears perked, watching the world blur past outside. Jack, on the other hand, couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at his chest. What if this was a mistake? What if they were making a promise they couldn't keep? But then Duke rested his head on Jack's knee, a silent reassurance. Jack exhaled. We're doing this together, buddy. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Part 4. A new beginning isn't always easy. The shelter was nothing like Jack expected. After years of being turned away, ignored, and treated like an outsider, he had assumed this place would feel the same. But as the car pulled up to a modest-looking building on the outskirts of the city, he noticed something different. There was no sign of hostility, no security guards watching him like a threat. Instead, there was a man waiting outside with a warm smile. Duke, curled up beside Jack in the car, lifted his head and sniffed the air. His ears twitched, a sign of cautious curiosity, not fear. Jack, on the other hand, was terrified, because hope had always been dangerous. The first steps inside. Margaret stepped out first, greeting the man at the entrance with a firm handshake. Jack, this is David. He runs the shelter, she introduced. David stepped forward, offering his hand. It's good to meet you, Jack. And you too, Duke. Jack hesitated. Duke did not. The golden-furred dog stepped forward, sniffed David's outstretched palm, and wagged his tail. Jack exhaled, finally taking David's hand. Yeah, nice to meet you. David smiled, gesturing toward the entrance. Come inside. Let's get you both settled. A roof over their heads. Jack hadn't slept in a real bed in years. The shelter wasn't a luxury hotel, but it was warm, clean, and, most importantly, Duke was welcome. David led them to a small private room with 2 beds, one for Jack, one for Duke. There was even a fresh dog bed and a bowl of food waiting. We don't have much, David admitted, but we do our best to make sure both people and their pets feel at home. Jack's throat tightened. He couldn't remember the last time someone had tried to make him feel at home. Thank you, he said quietly. Duke, already sniffing around the room, hopped onto his bed and let out a content sigh. Jack chuckled. I guess he approves. David smiled. That's all that matters. But even as Jack lay down on his own bed that night, something didn't feel right. He wasn't used to this. The warmth, the comfort, the kindness. And part of him couldn't help but wonder, how long before it all disappeared? Adjusting to a new life. The next few days were strange. Jack no longer had to wake up with his body aching from the cold. He didn't have to ration tiny scraps of food, but he also didn't know what to do with himself. He was surrounded by other people like him, men and women who had lost everything, but were trying to rebuild. Some had been there for months, others just a few weeks. You get used to it, one of them told Jack over breakfast. Jack wasn't sure if he wanted to get used to it. He had spent so long on the streets that the idea of stability felt foreign, almost wrong. And then there was Duke. Duke adjusted almost instantly. He made friends with the staff, played in the small outdoor area, and never stopped watching Jack, making sure he was okay. But Jack wasn't okay, because deep down, he still didn't trust it, didn't trust that this would last. The fear of losing Duke. One evening, Jack sat with David in the shelter's small office. I know this transition is hard, David said. You've been on your own for so long. It's not easy to suddenly rely on others. Jack shrugged. I'm not trying to be ungrateful. I know. David leaned forward. But I also know that trust takes time. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. I can't shake the feeling that this isn't real, that any second, someone's going to tell me Duke can't stay, or that we have to leave. David sighed, folding his hands on the desk. Jack, no one here is going to take Duke from you. Jack swallowed. You say that now, but I've been in places that say they'll help. And then the moment it gets too hard, too inconvenient, I get tossed back onto the streets. And this time, I have him to think about too. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Duke is your family, and we don't separate families here. Jack looked up, searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. He found none. That's the difference between us and the other places you've been. David continued. We don't just give people a bed. We give them time. And we don't take away the things that keep them going. Jack glanced at Duke, who was curled up near his feet, peacefully asleep. For the first time, Jack let himself believe. An unexpected test. Things were getting better. Jack was helping out around the shelter, fixing things that needed repairs. It gave him a sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Duke was thriving, happy, and healthier than he had been in years. Then, one afternoon, a man arrived at the shelter, looking for help. His clothes were torn, his face bruised. He was thin, trembling from exhaustion. Jack recognized the look in his eyes. He had seen it in his own reflection too many times. But there was something else about this man, something familiar. And then it hit him. It was the man Duke had scared away that night on the streets. The man who had tried to rob Jack. Jack's body went rigid. Duke growled softly, sensing Jack's unease. David noticed. You okay? Jack clenched his jaw. I know him. David frowned. Who is he? Jack hesitated. Did it matter? This man was just like him. Another person who had fallen through the cracks. Another person who had made mistakes because he was desperate. Jack took a slow breath. He's someone who needs help. David studied him for a moment before nodding. Then we help him. And just like that, Jack realized something important. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was healing. And maybe he was finally home. Part 5, A Forever Home. Jack sat in the quiet shelter office, staring at the man he once feared, the man who had tried to rob him on the streets. The man, whose name was Troy, looked different now. His shoulders were hunched, his hands trembling slightly as he held the cup of coffee David had given him. He looked exactly how Jack had felt when he first arrived at the shelter, lost, suspicious, and unsure if he even deserved help. Jack took a deep breath, glancing down at Duke, who was sitting at his feet, ever watchful. You hungry? Jack asked. Troy hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Jack got up, walked to the small kitchen, and grabbed a sandwich from the community fridge. He set it down in front of Troy without a word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Troy whispered, "I'm sorry, man." For that night, Jack studied him, his expression unreadable. "Why'd you do it?" he finally asked. Troy's jaw tightened. He stared at the sandwich like it held all the answers. "I was starving and desperate." Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know what that feels like." And just like that, the weight of resentment lifted. Because Jack understood something now, Troy wasn't his enemy. The streets were. And Duke had saved them both from that night ending in something much worse. Becoming part of something bigger. Over the next few weeks, Troy slowly started to settle in at the shelter. Just like Jack had. He worked odd jobs, helped in the kitchen, and never stopped apologizing to Jack, even when Jack told him to drop it. "You already said you were sorry," Jack muttered one day as they scrubbed the floor together. "I'm not exactly the kind of guy who holds a grudge." Troy smirked. "Nah, but your dog does. He still side-eyes me every time I walk past." Jack chuckled, looking down at Duke, who was lying nearby, watching Troy with an unimpressed expression. "He's just making sure you're not gonna do anything stupid again," Jack said. Troy exhaled. "I don't plan to." And for the first time in years, Jack believed him, because the streets changed people, but so did kindness, a job offer, and a choice. One evening, David pulled Jack aside. "You've been with us for a while now," David began. "You've helped out, you've been responsible, and you're great with the other guys here." Jack frowned. "You trying to butter me up for something?" David chuckled. "I want to offer you a job," he said simply. "A real one, here at the shelter." Jack blinked. "What?" "We need someone on staff who understands what it's like out there," David explained. "Someone who's been through it, who can help new people adjust. And you've already been doing that, whether you realize it or not." Jack's chest tightened. For so long, he had felt like he was just existing. Now, for the first time, he was being offered a future. "You don't have to say yes now," David added. "But think about it." Jack swallowed. "And Duke?" David smiled. "Duke's part of the package. Wouldn't offer you the job otherwise." Jack exhaled, running a hand through Duke's fur. "I'll think about it," he said. And for the first time in years, he actually meant it. The last night on the streets. A few days later, Jack took Duke for a walk, not to find shelter, not to scavenge for food, but just because they could. They passed through the city streets, the same ones that had once felt so cold and unforgiving. Jack paused near an alleyway, the same one where he had found Duke all those months ago. "Crazy, huh?" he murmured. "That night, I thought I was saving you, but you're the one who saved me." Duke wagged his tail, as if agreeing. Jack crouched, pressing his forehead against Duke's. "We made it, buddy." For the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like he was waiting for the next disaster. He wasn't waiting for kindness to be taken away, for Duke to be forced from his side, for another cold night to steal their strength. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And as he walked back toward the shelter, the place that was no longer just a temporary stop, but a real home, Jack finally let himself believe it. Because this time, no one was leaving. Epilogue, a home. At last, Jack took the job. He became a mentor to new arrivals at the shelter, helping them adjust, showing them that their past didn't have to define their future. Duke became the unofficial therapy dog of the shelter. Whenever someone new came in, scared and lost, Duke was the first to greet them, just like he had done for Jack. Jack never forgot the streets, but he never had to go back. And neither did Duke, because they finally had what they had spent so long searching for. A home, a family, and a new beginning. Together. Forever. The end. This story is a tribute to all the homeless people and their dogs, the ones who stay together through everything, proving that love and loyalty aren't defined by circumstances. Thank you for reading Jack and Duke's journey. Jack and Duke's story is just one of many. Across the world, countless people and their loyal dogs face hardships together, proving that love isn't about wealth or comfort, it's about being there, no matter what. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share. And don't forget to subscribe to Dog Discoveries with Florence for more inspiring stories of loyalty. survival, and second chances.